Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. In December 2023, the IAASB issued the international standards on auditing for audits of financial statements of less complex entities, also known as the ISA for LCE. The ISA for LCE is a pioneering standard and significant milestone addressing the unique needs of audit of smaller and less complex businesses. It's a standalone global audit standard that is built on the foundation on the ISAs, and an audit performed in accordance with this standard provides the same level of assurance as an audit on the ISAs, also reasonable assurance. In this webinar, we will cover different aspects of the standard. We will run through the purpose of the standard, what it's trying to achieve. We will go more into the authority, when auditors can and cannot use the standard. We'll look into the flow of the standard and the content of the standard itself, and cover some of the benefits of the standard, and also look into adoption and implementation. As you may have seen in the webinar, we have a Q&A function. So we encourage people to submit questions throughout the presentation. We may pick up some of the questions and respond to them as we go through the presentation, but we also have some time towards the end to answer additional questions. Don't be afraid if your question is not picked up in the session. We will use the questions also as basis for updating our FAQs, and also the material from this presentation will be used in development of the first-time implementation guide. So if I can get the next slide. In this webinar, you will meet different people covering different parts of the section. Myself, Kai Morten Hagen, an IAASB board member, and also was the chair of the task force that developed the standard. Together with me, I have Jasper van den Hout, an IAASB director, also part of the task force, Kazuko Yoshimura, IAASB staff fellow, and Isabel Reik, IAASB senior manager, that will be doing different parts of the presentation. But I also have with me one of the fellow members of the task force, Vivian Bauer, that will help on some of the questions and answer them as we go. So you'll hear more from these people throughout the presentation. So if we go to the next slide, just going through a couple of housekeeping rules. The webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes, including Q&A. As I said, we may respond to some questions in the presentation itself, but we also have time to pick them up towards the end. All participants will be muted, so there will be no sound coming through. If you, when you want to submit a question, click the Q&A button on your screen and submit a question to us via the Q&A function, and we will pick them up, as I said, either during the presentation, after, or be used as updating of the material. I think with that, we can go to the next slide and then go over to the first part of the presentation itself. In this part, we will then cover what is the ISA for LCE seeking to achieve and why it was developed. So I think if I can get the next slide. Sorry. SMEs make a critical contribution to the world's economy. And if you look at quantitatively, a majority of the audits being performed are audits of SMEs. Different numbers in different jurisdictions, but if you look across the world, more than 90% of the entities in general are SMEs. And a lot of these have audits being undertaken for various reasons. Some jurisdictions have mandated audit in law or regulation as statutory audits, and some of them have voluntary audits being performed for other reasons, either for stakeholders or other reasons, or just have for management purpose. So majority of the entities are SMEs. If you look into audit standards, the ISAs in general are designed to be appropriate to be applied for a variety of entities, different circumstances of size, complexities, and the nature and circumstances. Some of them are simpler, some are more straightforward, like the LCEs, and some that are more complex, like public interest entities and listed entities in general, having more complex structures, more complex information systems, controls, and transactions. So having that in mind, the ISAs are developed to cover all of those. IAASB have always been mindful of the need for ISAs to be scalable, to be used for all types of audits, for audits of all entities, regardless of size or complexity. However, as time has gone by, the operating and reporting environment is becoming more and more complex and constantly, continually evolving. And in addition, the spotlight on quality of audits as a result of audit inspections and high profile corporate failures, that has been commonly associated with more complex entities, has led to more specificity and details being also put into the standards, and has been a growing concern about the length, complexity, and understandability of the ISAs, and also the ability to apply to audits of less complex entities. As a response to this, in many jurisdictions or regions, different initiatives have been undertaken, targeted at audits of less complex entities. And some jurisdictions have announced that they will start developing a separate standard. Some have even developed a standard and taking that into use. And by these developments and the increase of the probability of fragmentation in standards of a large section of the audit market is one of the reasons why IAASB undertook this project, as there is a need for a global solution to ensure high quality and that audits being performed for this market is consistent and being performed in all jurisdictions. So if we go on to the next slide, this slide shows the journey that the IAASB has been on with this project. Since the finalization of the clarified ISAs in 2009, the focus and challenges of the needs and stakeholders for the LCE community has been more and more come more and more to our attention, and has been something that, as you see from the slide, that we've worked on consistently. We've consulted with different groups and have update from IFAC and the IFAC SMP advisory group. We have now outreach targeted to different stakeholder groups representing interest of small mid-sized practitioners, and typically federations also been covering those. And we've had outreach with national standard setters, what they're doing, regulators, and audit oversight bodies. And we also discussed with the representatives from formal firms and auditors serving the LCE community, serving audits of LCEs. We had information gathering starting, I think, 2017. We had multiple conferences in Paris trying to identify what the issues are, what the solution should be. We approved the project proposal to develop a separate standard in December 2020, and in July 2021 we had the exposure draft. As you may remember, one of the questions in the exposure draft was related to group audits, and we got a clear steer from the ED that group audits should be part of the standard. So we developed that and a separate ED on group audits published in January 2020. The board, IAASB, approved the ISA for LCE in September 2023, and after the approval of the PRB, the standard has now been released and will be effective for audits beginning on or after December 15, 2025. That being said, early adoption is permitted and encouraged, so it's up to the jurisdictions, as we'll come to later, when or if or when it will come into effect in your jurisdiction. One thing I forgot to mention in the beginning was that the slides will be distributed to everyone in this webinar, so that you'll get them afterwards. If I can get the next slide. So what is the LCE standard? How did we develop it? The standard is a standalone standard, proportionate and tailored to the needs of the LCE audits. So what does that mean? Being a standalone standard means that this standard includes all necessary requirements to be able to do an audit and to obtain reasonable assurance as the objective with the standard. There is no reference back to the ISA, so it's not saying go to ISA this and this to perform additional requirements. That also means that if you're outside of the scope of the standard, that you encounter something that it's not intended to be in the standard, you cannot go to the ISA and pick up those requirements in addition and still perform an audit under the ISA for LCE. If you're outside the scope, you cannot use the standard, but you can always look back into the ISA for additional material guidance and examples if you wish to, but there is no requirement to do so, and you cannot go to top up with additional procedures, as I said, if you're outside of scope. I also said the standard is proportionate and tailored to the needs of an audit of an LCE. That means that situations that is not common for these type of audits have been excluded. Sometimes, as you'll see later on, the objective of the standard is the same as with the ISA, but the way that you go to get there may be a little bit different than in a large complex audit. That leads to a standard that is more proportionate and tailored to this type of audits, and it's easier to navigate for practitioners for these type of engagement. And the examples and everything that is in there is specifically developed for these type of audits. The standard recognized that the importance of the audits for smaller and less complex businesses are different. They're not different or lesser, or there are not lesser quality needs or need for lesser audits. It's just that it's different. That is reflected throughout the standard. And as I said, we don't have application material as you're familiar with in the ISAs, but we have essential explanatory material, what is essential for the auditor. So standard has been tailored more specifically, as I said, for these type of audits and following the flow of the audit itself. So if we go on to the next slide. This slide just shows the different types of engagements that we have in our ISA toolbox, so to say, ranging from compilations with no assurance, review engagements from 2400 under limited assurance, and audits as you see, with reasonable assurance, and the level of assurance, whether you do an ISA audit or an audit under the ISA for LCE, is the same. It's still a reasonable assurance. The purpose of audit, as we all know, is to enhance the degree of confidence of the intended users, and those needs are the same, whether it's the different on all types of entities. And that's been our goal throughout the development, that it's not to develop a lesser standard, but it's to develop a standard specific for these type of audits, still being able to achieve reasonable assurance in the end. So if we go on to the next slide. As I mentioned earlier, audits traditionally has been performed under the ISAs globally, and having a global solution also for these type of audits of LCEs, helps maintain the confidence in the financial reporting of LCEs, and provide the trust and confidence to market and investors that need them in making their decisions. It's also having a global standard helps promote consistent application, making sure that an audit performed is the same, and that it reduces the risk of jurisdictional divergence and driving consistency and comparability globally. As you see a little bit later, each jurisdiction can set their own boundaries, whether they want to use the standard and set the threshold for who the types of engagement, the types of audits that can be done with the standard, but still having a global solution, make sure that they are being performed in a consistent way globally. If you go on to the next slide. So why we have this ISA for LCE is more or less a summary of what I said a little bit earlier as well. It helps the auditor deliver consistent and effectively high quality audits for audits of less complex entities. As I mentioned earlier as well, a huge number or a majority of audits are audits being performed of SMEs, which in many cases could be qualifying as less complex entities. Audits of them are important, even though you can say that the findings and failures in SME audits may not be perceived as critical as in public interest entities or listed entities. It's still important to the public interest that it is of high quality, and that since they still have a significant contribution to the world economy, and therefore it's important to have a standard specifically for these to make sure that we still have high quality audits for these types of engagement as well. So if we go on to the next slide, we have some related resources that's been developed and released together with the standard. If you go on the IAASB webpage, there is a separate ISA for LCE portion of that page where you can access these materials and also future material coming up. There is a few frequently asked questions section. There's also a video series exploring the benefits of using the standard, and also that's also where we will publish the first time implementation guide when that is ready.
So Kai, maybe we have one question received beforehand that I was wondering whether maybe you could answer. Does using the ISA for LCE change the quality of the audit, or means less work is needed to be performed in an audit? Would you mind elaborating on that to clarify that for everyone?
Sure, I can do that, Jasper. As I mentioned earlier, the ISA for LCE does not reduce the quality of the audit or necessarily mean less audit work. It's designed for a different type of audit, so to say, and specifically tailored for this these type of entities. So it's not a lesser audit. It will help the auditors focus on the aspects of the audits that are relevant for less complex entities. And you can almost say it's about doing the right work, including the right amount of work in the right areas. And the standard will have the proportionate requirements to drive that. So it's not, we didn't design the standard to do less, but it was specifically to do how would you make sure you do the right things. And I think also you can say that as you see a little bit later, the objective in the standard is the same as in the ISOs and be built on the same principles, but the way you go to get to the goal may be a little bit different, maybe a little bit more direct in some areas when you deal with less complex entities.
Thank you. That's the only question that we had right now. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So I will be presenting this section, and in this section we'll be discussing when the ISO for LCE can be used. Can we go to the next slide? So there are a few steps that need to be taken before the ISO for LCE can be used on an audit engagement. First of all, jurisdictions need to adopt the ISO for LCE. As the ISO for LCE is a standalone auditing standard, the adoption of the standard may take some more time and effort than when there's a new or revised ISA, which sometimes is automatically adopted in a jurisdiction. So Kai will later go through the steps to adopt the standard, and therefore I won't elaborate on this now, but we'll come back to that. So once the standard is adopted in the jurisdiction, firms will need to create their own policies and procedures for use of the standard. So for example, the firms want to maybe further restrict the use of the ISA for LCE because of a certain risk profile of its clients. And then lastly, which is the a step that you as an auditor will often see in doing an engagement, the engagement partner must evaluate if the ISA for LCE can be used for the audit engagement based on the requirements as set out in the authority. The auditor makes an initial determination during the acceptance and continuous stage of the audit, but there's also a stand-back requirement to make sure that the initial determination is still correct once the auditor has completed its planning activities and has identified and assessed the risk of material misstatement. And then lastly, it's also important for the auditor to be alert for new information that may signal that using the standard is not appropriate anymore. And this is then mainly throughout the audit when the audit is performed. So let's now go in a bit more detail to the requirements in the authority of the ISO for LCE. So on this slide, there's a lot of information, but the main question is, which audit engagements can use the standard? That's the key question. The title of the standard is clear. It's an auditing standard for less complex entities. But what is a less complex entity? That's a key question, and the IAASB had a lot of discussions about it. The authority sets out what in our view is a less complex entity, and therefore for which entities the standard can be used. Looking at the authority, it's important to note that there are three criteria to take into account. You first have the specific prohibitions, then you have the qualitative characteristics and quantitative thresholds. Let's start with the specific prohibitions. These are specific type of entities for which the use of the standard is prohibited. The IAASB was of the view that the standard cannot be used for listed entities, entities with public interest characteristics, and with these entities you can think of banks and insurance companies. These are specifically highlighted in the standard. And then audits of group financial statements in which a component auditor is used. So only when a component auditor is used, but more on that a little bit later. So jurisdictions cannot remove specific prohibitions as set out in the standard. However, the ISO for LCE allows jurisdictions to add specific prohibitions. So you can add additional entities or categories of entities, but you cannot remove anything that's included in the authority. The second criteria to take into account are the qualitative characteristics. The ISO for LCE includes a list of qualitative characteristics that describe the typical nature and circumstances of an audit of an LCE. I won't go through all of them, but we'll just highlight two as an example. For example, the entity's business activities. The authority describes that the entity's business activities, business model, or the industry in which the entity operates do not give rise to significant, pervasive business risk. Another example is the organization and ownership structure. The authority states that the organizational structure is relatively straightforward, with few reporting lines or levels, and a small key management team, between brackets, e.g., 5 individuals or less. On these qualitative characteristics, there are 4 important things that I would like to highlight. Firstly, the list of qualitative characteristics as included in the ISAFER LCE is not exhaustive. Auditors may also consider other matters. Secondly, the list is not intended to be absolute. For example, the numerical indicators are intended to provide direction and are not absolute. So in the example that I gave, if there are 6 individuals in the management team, it does not automatically mean that the entity is not an LCE. Thirdly, it's a very important point. Each of the qualitative characteristics may not, on its own, be sufficient to determine whether the ISAFER LCE is appropriate or not appropriate to use. So the auditor needs to look at the qualitative characteristics combined or holistically. Lastly, the EAM explains that if there is uncertainty about whether an audit meets the qualitative criteria as set out in the authority, the use of the ISAFER LCE is not appropriate. So these are some things that are also in the authority, but I thought is important to highlight for you. The last criteria to take into account are the quantitative criteria. In developing the standard, the IAASB anticipates that jurisdiction will determine quantitative thresholds for using the ISAFER LCE. Why have we done that? The reason behind that is that the IAASB was of the view that determining quantitative thresholds assist in the consistent and appropriate use of the ISAFER LCE. The IAASB did not set quantitative thresholds itself, as it is hard to set examples given the difference between jurisdictions around the globe. For example, if we would have set quantitative thresholds that would work for some jurisdictions, the same thresholds may be too high or too low for other jurisdictions. However, to help jurisdictions, we included 2 examples of quantitative thresholds. For example, we included the European Commission's definition of a small enterprise and the South African Department of Small Business Development's definition of a small enterprise. It's important to note that the IAASB won't be updating these thresholds for changes made subsequently by the European Commission or the South African Department of Small Business Development, as it is not about the exact criteria, but are examples of how jurisdictions may define a small enterprise. For example, like recently, the European Commission announced to revise its definition of a small enterprise, and this was done shortly after the ISAFER LCE was approved. So we will not update the quantitative thresholds in the standard, but we recognize that the new size criteria set by the European Commission may be appropriate to use in determining whether the ISAFER LCE can be used or not. One last matter on these quantitative thresholds. So these quantitative thresholds, they may be set for all entities within a jurisdiction, or you also may have different thresholds. It's maybe set for entities within a specific industry. So that's up to the jurisdiction to determine. I highlighted earlier that I would go back to the group audits. I noted that the standard cannot be used for group audits when there are component auditors used. However, there is one exception that is important. The authority allows the use of component auditors when the component auditor's involvement is limited to circumstances in which a physical presence is needed for specific audit procedures. So the authority includes 2 examples. That's a physical inventory count or physically inspecting assets or documents. The IAASB had a thorough debate on whether to allow the use of component auditors for when using the standard. So on one hand, we noted that component auditors are often more used in more complex groups. So having this included in the standard would signal that more complex entities could be included. So that could give a message that we don't want to give. On the other hand, the IAASB recognized that the use of component auditors may sometimes be due to practical considerations rather than due to complexity of the group itself. So with the current requirement, we landed in the middle, and we hope that this signals that you can sometimes still use the ISFR LCE, and therefore that it still be useful for auditors to use that have, for example, have an inventory account that is located somewhere else. The last thing on the group audit, so we also added specific quantitative thresholds for group audits. So when you are group auditors also need to assess the group's audit structure and the group's consolidation process. These quantitative thresholds are in addition to the quantitative thresholds that are anyway need to be assessed. Can we go to the next slide? So this slide shows the resources that we already have published or will publish. So as Sky already mentioned before, we already published the frequently asked questions document. And we also have, in the video series, we have a closer look at the applicability and use video, which further dives into the authority of the standard and what I've just been highlighting. Then the other document that we're working on and hope to publish later this quarter is the supplemental guide on the authority. And that's all for this section. Kai, were there any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions that we received now that I think is beneficial to have together with this section. The first one is a question whether it is mandatory for just jurisdiction to determine quantitative thresholds when tailoring the authority. So is it mandatory for jurisdictions to do that?
Yeah, Kai, it's not mandatory for jurisdictions to do that. So that's very clear. It's not required, but we do, and the standard anticipates that jurisdictions will do that. And the reasons for that is one of them I gave earlier in the webinar. So it will help to clarify the scope, the standard, and narrow it appropriately. On the other hand, it's also it's a backstop as well. So it's a backstop in the consistent use of the standard and making sure that the right entities are being audited while using this standard. So to answer your question, it's not required, but it is anticipated.
Thank you. The other question that's come through that's related to this section is there any guidance for practitioners on how to manage transitioning out of the ISAs if you, during the course of the audit, figure out that you're now no longer within scope? So it changes the complexity. So will there be any guidance on that?
So this was something that came up a lot in responses to the exposure draft. So there was a question like what happens because at the audit you might not know everything yet during the acceptance and continuous stage. So we made a few changes to the standard to make sure that this scenario is not happening that frequently. I think it's mainly around based on the comments we received on the exposure draft is mainly around accounting estimates that there were concerns that you might suddenly find a complex accounting estimate during the audit. And so what we did, we added additional requirements for accounting estimates. We widened the scope a little bit. So it says right now as well in the authority that a less complex entity would ordinarily not have complex accounting estimates. And by adding that word ordinarily, we allowed a little bit of flexibility that sometimes there could be one more complex estimate that you weren't aware of at the beginning of the audit when you decided to use the ISFR LCE. Because of that said, we added additional requirements in part 7. There's the section on accounting estimate. We elaborated more and put it more requirements and guidance to address those situations. So that is what we've done. I think generally about the transition, the implementation guide will include more information on that, on the transitioning in and out of the ISFR LCE. So I would expect as well that guide would also deal in more specificity with the situation you just described. that when during the audit you would need to, what happens if suddenly you need to move out of the ISAFR LCE?
Yeah, so what you're saying is that it was something that came up in the ED quite a lot, but given the changes that happened since, we don't believe that you will come across that situation frequently. But if you do, there will be some guidance to help you on how to transition.
Yeah, that's correct, Kai.
Yeah, thank you. I think then we can move on to the next slide. And Kazuko, I'll hand over to you to take us through the next section.
Thank you, Kai. So now that you understand when the standard can be used, in this section, I want to give you an idea of what the ISO 4 LCE looks like. I will walk you through what the design principles of the ISO 4 LCE are, the differences of the ISO 4 LCE compared to the ISOs, and the layout of the parts in the ISO 4 LCE. Next slide, please. So let me start with the broad foundational concepts in which the standard is designed. First, risk-based approach and principle-based. The standard is designed using a risk-based approach, and it has been written to be principle-based. These enables the standards to be applied to less complex entities with a wide range of circumstances and across sectors or industries. And then focus on expected output. The ISO 4 LCE is focused on the expected output of a requirement, meaning the standard is focused on what the outcome of the requirement is that the auditor needs to achieve. Intuitive structure. The structure of the standard follows the natural flow of the audit from client acceptance or continuance to reporting. I will explain more about this in the next slide. Clear, understandable, and concise. The requirements have been written to be clear, understandable, and concise, avoiding any unnecessary words, repetition, or ambiguous language. Use of core ISO concepts. The IAASB has used the requirements in the ISOs as a basis for the requirements within the ISO 4 LCE. This was accomplished by replicating and adapting requirements from the ISOs that are considered core to an audit for the nature and circumstances of less complex entities as contemplated by the ISO 4 LCE. Next slide, please. So moving into the standard itself, the standard includes a preface, authority, and part 1 to 10. Preface explains the responsibilities of the auditor and management and the format of the ISO 4 LCE. Authority was already explained by Jasper in the previous section, and the content of part 1 to 10 will be explained by Isabel later. Here, I want to focus on the intuitive structure of the parts. The parts in the standard has been structured to follow the flow of an audit, starting with matters that are overarching to the audit. Fundamental concepts and overarching principles are in part 1. General requirements on audit evidence and documentation and quality management on the engagement level are in part 2 to 3. Procedural aspects of the audit from the acceptance or continuance of the audit engagement through to reporting are in part 4 to 9. Additional requirements applicable solely in the context of the audit of group financial statements are in part 10. Next slide, please. In this slide, I want to touch on the difference of ISO 4 LCE compared to the ISOs. The ISO 4 LCE does not reduce the quality of the audit or necessarily mean less work when comparing to the ISOs. However, the standard itself is different than the ISOs. For example, authority. As discussed earlier, the ISO 4 LCE can only be used when all criteria set out in the authority are met. The ISOs can be used by any type or size of entity. The structure. The IAASB developed the ISO 4 LCE as a standalone, self-contained standard. The ISO 4 LCE has been developed to help auditors understand the flow of an audit with clear and understandable requirements. Audit concepts have been regrouped to take into account the typical process of the audit of an LCE. For example, Part 5, Planning, in the ISO 4 LCE includes requirements about determining materiality, as these steps are performed together in practice. In the ISOs, planning the audit and determining materiality are two different standards. Requirements. Although the ISO 4 LCE is based on the core requirements from the ISOs, it does not contain requirements relating to prohibited entities, or where there are matters or circumstances that would have been deemed more complex. The guidance. In the ISO 4 LCE, essential explanatory material has been included directly in the body of the standard together with the related requirements, as opposed to the application material presented at the back of the standard in the ISOs. The ISO 4 LCE approach helps connecting the guidance to the relevant requirement. And the examples. In the ISO 4 LCE, examples are focused on less complex entities, and in the ISOs, the examples are focused on a wide range of entities. Next slide, please. Next, I want to introduce how each part in the standard looks like. Each part is structured the same way, starting with introduction, broadly explaining the content of the part, followed by the objective of the part, and then the necessary requirements together with any relevant essential explanatory material. Introduction is included in a separate box, setting out the content and scope of that part. It does not create any additional obligations for the auditor. Following the introduction is the objective. Objective will link the requirements of that part and the overall objective of the audit. The objective focuses the auditor on understanding what needs to be accomplished and deciding whether more needs to be done in the particular circumstances of the audit. After the objectives are the requirements and essential explanatory material. The requirements taken together will fulfill the overall objective of the auditor. Compliance with these requirements is intended to support how the auditor obtains sufficient appropriate audit evidence as a basis for the auditor's reasonable assurance opinion. The auditor is required to comply with all relevant requirements in the ISO 4 LCE, except where the requirements is conditional and the condition does not exist. The requirements are expressed using shall, and the requirements have been drafted in such a way that is intended to make it easy to follow and clear for users of the standard. Essential explanatory material. Going forward, please let me call it EM for short. EM is designed to provide further explanation relevant to a subsection or a specific requirement. All EM is presented in italics within separate blue boxes. There are two types of EM. General introductory EM that explains the context of the section that follows, and EM specific to the requirement directly above the EM. The EM serves a similar purpose to application and other explanatory material in the ISOs, but is much more limited than what is presented within the ISOs, and is generally targeted at a higher level, taking into account the typical nature and circumstances of audits for which the standard has been designed. The broad principles used for inclusion of EM in the ISO 4 LCE are: the EM paragraphs do not create additional obligations for the auditor and do not include a shall. Not every concept or requirement is explained. EM has only been provided when it is deemed to provide crucial support to the appropriate application of the concept or requirements. EM is not intended to provide detailed examples about how to apply a requirement, Rather, it contains descriptions of matters relevant to understanding and applying the concepts or requirements within the ISA 4 LCE. For example, it may explain more precisely what the requirement means or what the requirement is intended to cover. If deemed necessary, the EM may explain why a procedure is required to be undertaken. It may also be used to explain the iterative nature of the proposed standard where needed. The EM, where appropriate, may illustrate how a requirement could be applied for different circumstances. This illustrates scalability of the standard to the spectrum of entities that would likely fall within its remit. And lastly, requirements in EM that are only applicable when there are engagement team members other than the engagement partner are presented in a box with the header. Considerations when there are members of the engagement team other than the engagement partner. Next slide, please. So we went through together of what the ISA 4 LCE looks like in a very short time. If you want to gain a more in-depth understanding, we have frequently asked questions and video series at the ISA 4 LCE webpage, and the first-time implementation guide is to come. Please visit the ISA 4 LCE webpage to access the materials. So that's all I have for this section.
Thank you, Kusuko. We have one question relating to this section that I think will be beneficial to take now. With the ED of the standard, there was also mapping documents showing the mapping of the ISA requirements to the ISA for LCE. And the question is, will there be an updated version of these mapping documents being provided after now the standard has been finalized?
Thank you, Kai. So the mapping document itself will not be updated with the final standard. As you mentioned, the mapping document illustrated how the requirements from the ISAs had or had not been incorporated within the draft ISA for LCE. And the objective of the document was to help respondents to the exposure draft understand the ISA for LCE requirements when preparing their comment letters. However, the key differences between the ISA 4 LCE and the ISAs will be highlighted in the upcoming first-time implementation guide. So in short, the answer is no, but the key differences will be highlighted in the upcoming guide.
Thank you, Kusuko. I don't have any additional questions relating to this section now, but we may come back to it later.
Thank you.
I'd now like to hand over to Isabel to go through the next section of the standard.
Thank you, Kai. So Kazuko just mentioned it a few minutes ago, but we've seen the overall structure of the standard, so that follows the flow of an audit. Now we're going to take a deeper look at each of the section just to understand exactly what it contains and what has a little bit of difference with the ISAs. So if we go to the next slide. So the first slide is the broad concept and overarching matters. So really things that will be applicable throughout the audits. When we look at part 1, we see the fundamental concepts, the general principles, the overarching principles that really we need to apply throughout the audits. That includes the overall objectives of the auditors, the importance of using professional judgment and exercising professional skepticism, the overarching requirements to be applied throughout the audits with regards to fraud, law and regulation and related parties, the relevant ethical requirements and the firm level quality management, and the general requirements about communication with those charged with governance and management. And I just want to mention that those requirements, they are all also specific communication requirements within each of the parts when it's relevant. Part 2, we're looking at the requirements for obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence and the general documentation requirements. Again, this is a place that the IAASB has made proportionate to the need of an audit of an LCE. So part 3 describes the auditors and engagement partners' obligation and responsibilities for quality management in an audit. This is another place that the requirements are proportionate to the typical nature and circumstances of an LCE. A quick note on the quality management. So the ISO for LCE requires that the auditor manages the quality at the engagement level to obtain the reasonable assurance. But it also requires that the engagement partner must be a member of a firm that apply the ISQM, so the International Standards on Quality Management, or a national requirements that are at least as demanding as the ISQM for the quality at the firm level. So if we go to the next part, so we're going to get into the core requirements of an audit. Again, the flow of the standard really follows the typical phases of an audit. We start with agreeing the terms of the engagement all the way to concluding. And as I mentioned, each part contains some specific documentation and communication requirements that are really relevant to that part. So looking at part 4 first, because we start with accepting or continuing the client. So we have the requirements for agreeing the terms of the engagement, and that includes establishing that the preconditions for an audit are present, and also determining that the use of the ISO for LCE is appropriate. So really assessing the authority, as Jasper mentioned earlier today. You will find in that part also the requirements for the opening balances when it's an initial audit engagement. Part 5 will go into the planning. So the responsibility for planning the audit, including the engagement team discussion and setting materiality for the audit. Part 6 sets out the requirements for understanding the entity and its environment, the applicable financial reporting framework, and the entity system of internal control. It will also have the requirements for identifying risk of material misstatement and discuss assessing the inherent risk and control risk related to those material mistakes. Part 6, it's a really good example of where this standard has been made more proportionate to the nature and circumstances of an audit of an LCE. It combines certain requirements just because we've seen in practice that those requirements are performed together. So an example of that is the identification and assessment of risk of material misstatements is now one single requirement. Included in that requirement, it's also the requirements for determining the relevant assertion and the related significant classes of transaction, account balances, and disclosure. So the whole requirement is only one requirement as opposed to multiple requirements in the ISIS. Again, this has been done because this is how normally an audit of an LCE is performed. Part 7 sets out the requirements for design and implementation of responses to assess risk of material misstatements at the financial statement and assertion level, and that includes substantive procedures and test of control. This part also sets out some requirements for specific topics or specific focus area, such as the accounting estimate, inventory, going concern, and so on. Part 8 sets out the requirements for the evaluation of misstatements, concluding activities and evaluation. That includes going concern, subsequent event, the closing analytical procedures, and also have the requirements for obtaining written representation. We will find in Part 8 also the engagement partner's conclusion related to quality management. If we go to Part 9, so just the next slide, please. We'll see the requirements for forming an opinion. That includes all types of audit opinions, the content of the auditor's report, other information, and comparative information. Part 9 presents the reporting requirements using the following approach. So it provides a specified format for the unmodified auditor opinions, and the wording of the reports, it's not, you cannot depart from the wording of the report, except if it's for compliance with law and regulation. Part 9 also provides tables to present the requirements that relates to circumstances that may lead to a modification of the report and the text to be used in those modifications. And there's also tables to present the form and content when using emphasis of matter, the other matters paragraph, or further guide, the emphasis of matter, other matters, material uncertainty related to going concern, and other information paragraphs. In addition to Part 9, the IAASB is developing a non-authoritative guide that will provide further guidance and example on modifications to the auditor's report. That includes a number of illustrated reports. This guide will also addresses the changes to the auditor's report for emphasis of matter paragraph, the other matters paragraph, and guidance as to which report may be appropriate in various circumstances. Finally, we have part 10. We can just move on. Yeah, thank you. So those are the special considerations that apply to a group audit. So it really includes all the additional requirements that an auditor must comply when auditing group financial statements. It includes requirements for all phases of the audit. So planning activities, setting a group materiality, understanding the group environment, the applicable financial framework, and the group system of internal control. It also includes the requirements for identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatements and reporting to those assessed risk of material misstatements. So I think that's we went into a little bit deeper dive on each of the parts. There are some related materials that you can access if you want a little bit more details on those parts. They're all available onto the webpage.
Thank you, Isabel. There are a couple of questions that have come through. I think you touched briefly on some of them, but I think it's worthwhile looking into them a little bit more just now. One of the questions is, if you were to highlight any phase or any type of or areas where the requirements in the ISA for LCE is different than in the ISA, well, where would you point those specifically to be?
Yeah, so I think there's differences throughout the standard. All the requirements have been made more proportionate to the typical nature of an LCE, but I feel like there's a lot more differences in the planning phase. So just by combining some of the requirements, like I mentioned earlier, so even like in the planning part 5, it's including the requirements for materiality, and the overall planning, which is normally done at the same time in an LCE as opposed to different standard in the ISA. So we're combining those just to help the flow and the understanding of the requirements. The other place that I could point out is in part 6, when we do the understanding of the IT environment. So in the authority, it is prescribed that the IT environment is straightforward, it's simple, non-complex. So obviously the requirements that have been including in part 6 related to the IT environment has been made proportionate to that. So it doesn't include all the complex or understanding of those complex systems and what that might imply. So it's really proportionate to that because it's set up in the authority that that's the base for an LCE. Other requirements that have been, I don't want to say omitted, but placed differently in the standard is understanding the inherent risk factor in the planning phase. So as opposed to having a requirement to do that, it is placed as an essential explanatory material. So just to explain how to, that provides a bit more flexibility on how you're going to apply that. Yeah, I feel like the planning phase is a good phase that there's a bunch of differences. And then just in the responding to risk assessment, most of the requirements are there, but they've been placed differently. So part 7 includes the substantive analytical procedures, the requirements for external confirmation, and all the other section that in the ISAs, they are separate standards. So you have to go back and forth and change your where you look at for guidance. In the ISA for LC, it's all in one place in the responding to risk of material misstatements section. So those are the key differences.
Yeah, I think that's good examples. And as you say, typically around, this is also a risk-based audit. So it's not how you address the risks that are the main differences, but in the process maybe, or some of the differences, the process on how you identify and what are the details and granularity of the steps that you go through in as I said, in part 6 is an area where there are some differences. One of the other questions that come through is a question whether there are illustrative examples of the deliverables that can help auditors implement some of the requirements.
Yeah, so we haven't really touched on a lot of the appendices, but there are some appendices in the standard. One of them is an illustrative engagement letter. So that's an example of an engagement letter that auditors can use as a basis just to apply those requirements in part 4. There's also an illustrative engagement letter in the appendices of the standard. So that's another example. And then, like I mentioned, part 9, there is the illustrative auditor's report, and we'll have the guide to illustrate the modification that you can make to the report. So when you have other matters paragraph or a different opinion, so those will be in the supplemental guide that will come out later this year.
Good. Thank you for that, Isabel, and remind everyone if you have additional questions to send them through on the Q&A function throughout the presentation. I think then we can go to the next slide, and I will cover that. We will now move into the last part of the presentation. As I said earlier, we intend to also cover additional Q&As after this. In this section, I'll talk a little bit about adoption and implementation, and what should jurisdictions do in order to plan for and perform a successful adoption and implementation phase, and also what are the some of the steps that you should go through in that process. So if I go to there's the next slide. These are some of the steps that we line out that would help could help jurisdictions in going through the process of adoption implementation. These steps also, I think we mentioned a little bit earlier, that will be an adoption guide that will be that is under development and is to be released relatively shortly. Some of these steps you will recognize then when you find that guide being released. I think the first step here, setting up for success, is just in a jurisdiction, I think you need to designate a leader for the process so that someone is responsible for taking the process or taking charge of the process and making sure that it's run through. It should this should really come from the statutory authority that is responsible for the adoption of auditing standards. Is a recommendation, and that they will advocate for the adoption for the standard and provide strategic direction and the conditions for success. As you've heard earlier, it's in jurisdictions, it's not one person that can decide on auditing standards. This standard is developed to be an alternative to the ISA, so jurisdiction need to decide whether they want to implement and for which type of audits they want to implement. So you need to build consensus on implementation of the standard. So identifying who those should be and why you should implement the standard in your jurisdictions, and the benefits should be part of your process. I think also one question that is key to success in the beginning is whether you should translate the standard. Do you originally translate the ISAs to your language? Then you probably should do the same with this standard. So that is also a key question to look into in the beginning. Planning the process, you should have an adoption committee. I think it's important to include representatives from different stakeholder groups that is affected, that being audit firms, local standard setters, regulators. You could also be academics and users of financial statements, as they could also serve as a center or committee looking into issues that you may come across or questions you may come across in the process, sharing experiences, and someone that will also monitoring the use of the standard and throughout after the implementation itself. As with any process, also defining targets and deadlines. Another thing that's important also in this stage is to look into are there any jurisdictional issues? it's different how standards are implemented in your law in your jurisdiction. Some jurisdiction may mandate ISOs in their Auditors Act. Some have references to auditing practice or different. So identifying whether there is a need for a change in law or regulation early on is important. Throughout the process, it's important that you can also find resources in IAASB. So as we have just said, that there will be some adoption material that will help you with this as well. Another step is engaging with others. Other jurisdictions will be going through the same process as you. So talking to some other jurisdictions that are in the same process, maybe also talking to jurisdictions that have already or have considered developing their own standards. Some, as I said earlier, some jurisdictions have developed their own standards and also taken them into use. So talking to them and seeing what are issues and hints and tips that you can get from them is also a good idea. Reaching out to IFAC and IAASB is always where we can help, and or IFAC can share some of the common practices that's been done other places. And then going into step 4, which is something Jasper touched on earlier, tailoring or discussing the need for tailoring the authority of the standard. Defining the scope, so to say, would be an important step. Defining what are the public interest entities or entities that should be prohibited because of public interest characteristics. What are those? You have a public interest entity definition in your jurisdiction that you would like to use, or you want to modify classes of entities to use the standard or so, then defining those, and then discussing, as we said, discussing whether you want to establish a quantitative threshold and also what that threshold should be. As Jasper mentioned, in the standard, we did not, as IAASB, set a quantitative threshold, as it's difficult to set a global threshold, as the economy is so different in the different jurisdictions. And also, as Jasper mentioned, it was we put in an option for jurisdictions to set a quantitative threshold, which could also serve as a backstop. It's always about whether you're qualitatively a less complex entity and whether you are a less complex entity. But some jurisdictions, we heard through the process, they would like to cap, so to say, yes, you are a less complex entity, but if you're above a certain size criteria, indications are that you may not be as less complex as you think. So that may be reasons why jurisdiction may set their own quantitative thresholds. I think the last part on this slide is also you should have a communication plan, including key messages on the standard, what it is and what it's not. I think we mentioned multiple times earlier and earlier presentations that we've had questions around level of assurance. Is this a lesser audit? And so on. And it's not. It's about quality and driving the right behavior and what are the important parts of the audit, identifying those and going through them. So what are the key messages? Who should you talk to? Should you have webinars, direct messages, and so on, publications, and when you should do your communication. As I said, these all are areas that we will touch more on in the adoption guide. So if you go on to the next slide, some of these areas are frequently asked, have been covered in the frequently asked questions and also in the adoption guide that will be published later on, and will be available on our ISA for LCE webpage. So if you go to the next slide, it shows an overview of resources that are available on our webpage. We have the basis for conclusion that was published together with the standard, which goes a little bit more into detail on some of the decisions being made on some areas and the reasons why, and also the development process itself. You have the fact sheet, which is more fact-based on the standard, what it is, what it's not. Frequently asked questions. We will, as I said earlier, these are areas that we will keep updating as we get more questions, and may also update based on questions and comments received on this webinar. We have the video series on navigating the ISA for LCE that have 3 different steps. One is exploring the benefits. One is a closer look at applicability and use, and one a more step-by-step walkthrough of the standard. On the ISA for LCE webpage, you can also find an overview or a presentation deck that we've developed, which is an overview of the standard that you may utilize when you want to do a presentation on the standard, and may serve as a good basis for that. So if you go to the next slide, well, here are some things that is yet to come. As I said, the adoption guide, which is under development and I think to be released sometime in Q2. And then we have a supplemental guide on authority and supplemental guide on the reporting that are also under development, and the first-time implementation guide that is scheduled to be released in Q3 latest. So these are things that is yet to come. So that's a little bit adoption and implementation and resources that is out there to help jurisdictions going through the process of adopting, implementing, and having successful implementation.
Thank you, Kai. For this section, we received a couple of questions. Maybe I'll start with so can you please elaborate a little bit more on why their jurisdiction should adopt ISA for LCE? Especially, there was a comment saying that they're struggling to see the benefit of using ISA for LCE, especially considering the cost of new methodology, training staff, and maintaining 2 methodologies. So yes, that's the question. Why should their jurisdiction adopt ISA for LCE?
Yeah, I think we've touched on some of the more details to some of those questions in the presentation. I think in general, adopting the ISA for LCE will help the auditors do a more effective and efficient audit of these type of entities while maintaining high quality. As you just, when you went through the standard itself, and you can see the process is more aligned, or the standard is more aligned with the process you go through when you do an audit. So it's easier it's more aligned with how you do an audit, so it should be easier to find the requirements and also understand why you're doing certain things. As the standard has been designed specifically for the needs and for an audit of an LCE, and the requirements also reflect that. So in some areas where you in an audit of a complex entity have quite granular requirements, as we said, around identify or understanding of the entity, identifying risks, and so on. That's an area that is more specifically tailored to these type of entities, and the process that you go through in these areas may not be as detailed, or it's a different process you go through to get to an understanding and identifying those risks. So it's about, as this is also a risk-based audit, it's about understanding the entity, still identifying the right risks, and that's, you may have a little bit of a different process, But when you do the audit of the risk itself, the procedures or how to address the risk, those may not be that different whether you use the ISA or the ISA for LCE, because addressing the risk is still addressing the risk. So also, as Isabel mentioned, it's more around maybe planning and understanding and identification, where the process is more tailored specifically. So, and also, as said, by jurisdictions using the global standard instead of developing their own standard, I think it helps for reducing the risk of jurisdictional divergence and having a more consistent and comparable audits being performed globally on also these types of entities.
Thank you, Kai. So I understood that so this ISA for LCE is could be used more effectively and efficiently, and because the standard is tailored for the less complex entities, and it also helps for the global consistency. The other question that we received is about the maintenance, and especially there was a comment about like at IAASB currently, we have other projects and we are revising ISA 500, 570, 240. So how will they be reflected to the ISA for LCE? Can you please elaborate on the maintenance, please?
Sure, I'll do that. I must say that that was a question we also had in the ED, and we got somewhat a little bit of a mixed feedback on some of it. It's important to keep the standard up to date, while it's also we had request for a more stable base of the standard. It's an area where we deliberate quite a lot in IAASB. As we said earlier, the standard becomes effective for periods beginning on or after December 15th, 2025. As I said earlier, early adoption is permitted and encouraged. What we landed on is that we will have a stable base, a period of stability for 3 years in the beginning, so that jurisdictions, when they implement the standard, and practitioners, when they start using the standard, that they don't implement and have to change maybe even before the standard is effective. So that was something that we felt is important to have as the initial period of stability. We agreed on a period of 3 years. So there will not be, the intent then is to not have any changes coming into effect before periods beginning on or after December 15, 2028. If you look into standards that has been revised in the meantime or is under revision, I don't envision that there will be a long period of differences, whether there will be differences as well from the ISAs or the ISA for LCE, but that is something that we will look into going forward. The intent is that when the ISAs are revised on a specific topic, that it also be considered whether that the ISA for LCE should also be revised. Similar process as we've been through in this development of the standard itself. We intend that the assurance that you will obtain during this standard in the ISA is expected to be the same. So the objective of the audit and the procedures will be the same. So if something changes in the ISAs, we will have to consider whether it is applicable on an ISA for LCE, how it will be applicable, and then update changes on that.
Thank you, Kai. So those were the questions that we received specific to this section. Throughout this webinar, we received other questions, and I want to pick up some of the questions. Maybe I'll start with this one. It's related to authorities, so maybe Jasper, for the quantitative thresholds, can a jurisdiction, after consideration not to set any quantitative threshold, what will be considered as a deviation from ISO for LCE?
Thank you, Kazuko. I think the answer to this question is yes, and it's not required. As that just answer the question as well that came up earlier in the in the webinar. So yes, they can be they don't have to set quantitative thresholds. Again, we anticipate to do it, but again, if the answer is they don't get it, then if they don't get to that answer, think it's not needed in a jurisdiction, then it's not there's no requirement. So therefore, I would not expect that to be a deviation from the ISO for LCE, because the deviation is when you really are not requiring are not something that is required. You're not requiring that. So that would be my answer, Kazuko.
Thank you, Jasper. Maybe this is also related to authority, but Isabel, can jurisdictions use the new term publicly traded entity instead of listed entity?
Yeah, so there is currently an exposure draft for the ISAs to replace listed entities for publicly traded entities. Because it hasn't been approved yet, the decision was made for the ISFLC to keep using the term that has been approved by the IAASB, which is listed entity. When those revisions will be approved, so expecting later this year, we will be considering that revision in the first maintenance of the ISFLC as well. So at that point in time, the terms listed entity will be potentially replaced by publicly traded entity. In the meantime, I would advise that people stay with the listed entity, which is the approved term at the moment for the board.
Thank you, Isabel. Then the next question we received, Jasper, will ISQM be applicable to ISO for LCE, or does a part 3 will be independent?
Thank you, Kazuko. So ISQM1, the short answer is ISQM1 will be applicable for the ISO for LCE. So you have just a more broader answer. So you have quality management at the firm level and at the engagement level. So at the firm level that is in our standard ISQM1, and at the engagement level that is in part 3. So if you go in part 1, there's also a reference made to ISQM1. If you go to requirement 1.2.2 for the ones who love to go into to more details, and that requirement states that the engagement partner shall be a member of a firm that applies the ISQMs, including therefore ISQM1. So ISQM1 applies, and for the firm level, and part 3 is for quality management at the engagement level.
Thank you for Jasper. I think that is all we have. Maybe there are some questions that we weren't able to respond in this webinar, but we will definitely take a look, and maybe some of them will be reflected to the FAQs. So I'll hand it over to you, Kai.
Thank you, and thank you all for being part of the presentation and or the webinar. If we go to the next slide, as Kazuko said, if there are questions that we have not responded through that we've received, we will also look into them and use them as updating for our FAQs and other materials to come. If you have any further questions, yeah, I think it's good for you to consult with the available resources, as we pointed out on this page. The other part is also engage with your national standard setter and professional accountancy organization, and then also looking into liaising with IFAC and IAASB. You can ask us questions and additional comments that you may have later on. And below you here, you can see an email address where you can also reach out to send additional questions. think if you go to the next slide, which is the last one, I'll just thank everyone to being part of the webinar and for all the questions that we received. Thank you also to the fellow presenters and Vivian for helping us on questions received in the presentation. Just pointing out, if you follow us on Twitter or X, LinkedIn and YouTube, and register and subscribe for updates, you will be alerted when new material is released. So I think that's a good thing to do. And then good luck with adoption and implementation. And please share also your stories and what are your questions and comments on how you've succeeded in your different jurisdictions in your implementation and adoption process, and whether you adopted or not. So thank you all, and that's it for us for now.